And with us is also Matthew Spady. Matthew Spady is our partner in Upper Manhattan. He's been very, very helpful connecting us to local leaders, also moderating and sharing his knowledge in the history of Upper Manhattan. So it's a pleasure to have him here in this meeting as well. And thank you for joining again. And Lucy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Diego, and to the HDC, and of course, to everybody on this Zoom call today. It's such a pleasure to talk not only about Upper Manhattan, but how we go about researching the places that we love in the city that we think we know so well, but we can always know a little bit better, I think. So my name, as Diego said, is Lucie Levine, and I am a native New Yorker, a historian, a tour guide, and a writer. I focus on the history of New York City, and I aim to do that through a historical tour and event company, which I've been running for the last few years, called Archive on Parade. And the goal of Archive on Parade, or my goal in creating it, is to take our local history out of the archives and into the streets. So I use archival research to create walking tours, to create historical lectures, even things like local trivia nights. And so what I wanted to do this evening, before we dive into a interactive conversation, which I'm so excited to have, is to talk a little bit about Upper Manhattan, to talk about Washington Heights. And when I do, not only to tell you a little bit of history, but to tell you how one might go about finding that history, how I would go about finding that history as a historian, and talk about the local repositories and the local opportunities that we have to do that work, to take that history out of the archives and into the streets, because these are our streets, this is our city, this is our history. We live with history, history is all around us. There is a history of everything, and indeed everything is history, all human experience, all human creation. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about the history around us and how we might find it. So I'll start in Washington Heights. So welcome, everybody, to Washington Heights. All right. Now, Washington Heights has a history that goes back pre-Dutch, of course, to the people who first inhabited this land, who are the Munsee people of the Lenni-Lenape. Now, something like this image that I'm showing you right now is from the memorial history of the city of New York. So this is a view created in 1892 of what somebody is imagining they might have found in 16th century Manhattan. And so I found this online at the digital collections of the New York Public Library. So when we're thinking about the library's maps division, the library's maps division is really wonderful in terms of getting an understanding of the topography of the island, and then even the land use of the island, going forward from the pre-Dutch days to our own present time. So we can find something like this. We can also find Sanborn maps, fire insurance maps from the 19th century, showing us the way that lots are appointed in each neighborhood, things like that. And then, you know, if we're going through and we're looking at specific land use, you know, we can look at the Department of Buildings records, we can look at the municipal archives. There are any number of ways that we can get an understanding of what our city looks like and the way that our land has been used from pre-Dutch days forward. So originally, this is the land of the Munsee people. And then during the American Revolution, this was actually the site of what is sometimes called the Battle of Harlem Heights, what is sometimes called the Battle of Washington Heights. This is the Fort Washington Memorial, and this is administered by the Parks Department, which means that we can learn even more about this monument, who created it, how it was created, from the archives of the Parks Department itself. But when we think about this place and its role in the American Revolution, what's interesting to me is that if we go back to the New York Public Library, see, we can look at, here's an image of Washington at Washington Heights, looking across to the Palisades to what would have been Fort Lee. So we had Fort Washington, which was a fort created in 1776 by the Continental Army here in Washington Heights as George Washington is fleeing the Battle of Brooklyn, August of 1776. As he flees north into Washington Heights, we'll have the fortification at Fort Washington, and then we're pointing across to the fortification at Fort Lee in New Jersey. And when we think about that, then we get a place name, because there is still, of course, a Fort Washington today in New York in terms of Fort Washington Park. And then, of course, we have Fort Lee, New Jersey. So, but what I love about this image, and this is why I think the New York Public Library is so special when we think about this, is, okay, here's what Washington is seeing, or even what we would imagine Washington to be seeing. And look at what we're seeing now in Fort Washington Park, right? Same thing, right? And so when we walk through our city, that's what I love about this idea of taking something out of the archives and into the streets. It's because when we look at our city, we can literally see history around us. And how does it feel? What does it mean to us if we realize that as we walk through 21st century Manhattan, we see the same site as did George Washington? Now, speaking of George Washington and where he fought and lived in Washington Heights, we still have the Morris Jamel Mansion, which is the oldest standing private home in New York City. Sometimes downtown at Fraunces Tavern, they claim to be the oldest standing structure on the island of Manhattan, but that is mostly reconstruction. And so this is preserved in a different way. And so that can actually be, we can have that conversation of what does preservation mean and how is this different from Fraunces Tavern. And I think that that's a really interesting conversation to have. But this is administered by the Historic House Trust. And so there's records related to that from the Historic House Trust, which actually is headquartered at the Arsenal in Central Park, the same place where the Parks Department is actually headquartered, which is interesting. And then the Morris Jamel Mansion itself is a fabulous resource because it is a museum. And they have exhibitions as to how it went from a house to a museum. But also right now, currently, the Morris Jamel Mansion has gotten a grant to do research surrounding the Black community and how the Black community has always had a history here at the Morris Jamel Mansion, and of course, in the wider Washington Heights area. And in fact, to look into that history, what's wonderful is that there are a number of biographies and autobiographies of persons living in the neighborhood now and in the past who have interacted with the structures that we see around us. So for example, Paul Robeson, and we're gonna see his home a little bit later in what I'm gonna show you. In his autobiography in the 1950s, he wrote about the role that one of his ancestors played in the Battle of Harlem Heights, the Battle of Fort Washington, and also in the way that he felt about living so close to that colonial history. And so that's just a really nice way to dig into kind of a first person look at the history that we see around us. So there's that. And then, so when this area of Manhattan was built up, this was one of the last areas of Manhattan, because it's so far north, it's one of the last areas of Manhattan Island to have been developed residentially. So in the 19th century, you saw mostly farmland here, as well as palatial estates for the very wealthy. And so this was a palatial estate, of course, built in the 18th century, but it wouldn't be until the very late 19th century and then into the 20th century that we'll get the kind of density and development that we think of when we think of New York City. And so prior to that, this was really an oasis for the upper classes. And in fact, there is a marker here at the Morris Jamel Mansion that tells you 10 miles from New York City. And what that meant was 10 miles from City Hall. And so this was essentially a remote country estate. And so that's when we think of the very first homes that are built in this area, we can think of that mile marker of 10 miles from the city, because it was meant to be a place in the country. And so speaking of the country, we also have, this is the John James Audubon House, completed 1842 at what is now 156th Street. And Matthew Spady, who is on this call, has done a lot of historical research into what will become known as Audubon Park, the Audubon Park Historic District. And so I'm sure he'll discuss that on this call as well. But John James Audubon, of course, for whom the Audubon Society is named, was a naturalist, was somebody who was very much enamored of and steeped in the natural world. And that's why having a home here in Washington Heights, when it was such a remote space and so natural in terms of being able to go birding, for example, and to understand the natural world from this bluff along the Hudson, that was why he would want to live here. But when we're looking into something like the Audubon Society, for example, and the history of this man's life, we can actually find the records of the Audubon Society at the New York Public Library in its manuscripts division. And so while this home no longer stands, it's not as if the history is not around us. It's not as if it's gone. So I want to make that point really clearly, because this is a talk about preservation, and something that Matthew and Diego and I were talking about as we were developing this was, what do we do? What happens if a structure is not preserved? How do you find that history? And so this is a situation where if I want to learn more about John James Audubon, I have the opportunity then to go to the New York Public Library and to dig into those archives. You know, history is never really, I mean, it can be lost in the sense of if something is no longer in the record, yes, it's lost. But the point is, like, even if these structures no longer stand with us, we still stand with history. It's the space, the physical space of our city is still there. And if we have records of what had been there in the past, we can still learn our history. So speaking of a physical past, here we have Trinity Cemetery. So Trinity Cemetery was founded in 1843 by the Trinity Parish in Lower Manhattan. And it was founded because the Trinity Churchyard Cemetery was no longer able to allow internment. It had gotten full. And what's wonderful about this is that this is the last active burial space on the island of Manhattan. So this is currently, the history of this site is still evolving, which is really wonderful. But in terms of finding who lived here, who is a permanent resident, if you like, here, the records of this cemetery are kept by Trinity Church. And there are also wonderful online archives that are digitized by Trinity Church. And so they're available online as well as through the church itself. So the very people who I just spoke about before, the Jamels, the Audubons, as well as other illustrious New Yorkers, including the Astors, are buried here. And what's interesting to me is that we then have, in this regard, a history not only of the strength and the power of Trinity Church, which had been and remains the wealthiest parish in our city, but also an understanding of who were the people in the middle of the 19th century who would have had the estates in this neighborhood, who would have then been buried here. So we can see, here is the Jamel Mausoleum. So again, we're walking with history as we're walking through here. There's another historian in our city by the name of Eric Washington, whose work I really admire, who says that he appreciates cemeteries because they're parks with footnotes, which I, as a historian, also really appreciate, because anytime that I pass a grave, it means a number of things to me, but one is that I can learn, right? If I have a name and I have something like a birth date and a death date, I can then search archives, which means I can search the municipal archives for birth certificates, for marriage certificates. I can search, if I want to stay in my apartment, I can search on something like ancestry.com, which is actually available for free through the New York Public Library. And in that case, I can find things like census records. I can find things like church records. I can find things like passports for any number of people whom I might be looking for if I were to pass them in a cemetery. Then we have also in the 1840s something that began to transform this neighborhood. This is the High Bridge. So this crosses the Harlem River. This is the oldest standing bridge in our city. This was completed 1848. What we're looking at here is the High Bridge and the High Bridge water tower. The reason that we have a water tower here is because the High Bridge was actually built over the Croton Aqueduct. So the Croton Aqueduct was a system of bringing fresh, clean water to our city. And when it opened in 1842, the celebration of the opening of the Croton Aqueduct was the largest celebration in our city's history up to that time. And what helped, in terms of local history, what this crossing did, because it was the first real crossing across the Harlem River, was that it connected Upper Manhattan to the Bronx in a way that it had not been before, which meant that it allowed for the growth of the neighborhood more so than anything had prior to this. So when we're talking about the growth of the neighborhood beyond what would have been just palatial estates, we can think about something like the High Bridge doing that. And then in terms of where would I find the history of the High Bridge or the Croton Aqueduct, well, in that case, I would want to look in particular at the municipal archives, which very recently actually did a really wonderful public exhibit about the history of water in our city and the water system that we have today and what grew out of the Croton Aqueduct. I also might want to look at the archives from the Museum of the City of New York, which has really wonderful information about the Harlem River Speedway, which was created once this became essentially like a pleasure drive in the latter part of the 19th century, because you could, as you can today, this is a current photograph I took last week, because you could walk across the High Bridge, you could walk over the incredible engineering feat that was the Croton Aqueduct. It was then a way for 19th century New Yorkers to take leisure. And so with leisure came the buildup of leisure along the Harlem River, of which the Harlem River Speedway was one. And there's a lot of really wonderful painting and photography and information about that at the Museum of the City of New York. Okay. And then if we move now into the latter part of the 19th century. So we have this buildup of the neighborhood as almost like a pleasure garden, if you want, following the creation of the High Bridge. We then in the 1880s have the creation of this. This is Sylvan Terrace, and we're looking toward the Morris Jamel Mansion. So the Morris Jamel Mansion is directly where the trees are. And so this was developed in the 1880s. And how would we learn about this? Well, this is landmarked, which means that we can look into the work already done for us by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. We can look at that, that report. We can also because this is 1882, we can also look at census records, but we couldn't, for example, if we wanted to look at an 1890 census, we actually can't look at the 1890 federal census for Manhattan because it was destroyed in a fire. So that's very difficult, but there is an 1890 police census, which is really interesting at the New York Public Library. People don't know a lot about the police census, but it would tell us who lived in these buildings and their ages and what their family structures were. And so we would get more information about who was living here. So that's one way to do it. And then we have in the 1890s the creation of brownstones in the neighborhood, which we see here on Jamel Terrace. And Jamel Terrace is also landmarked. So that would be another place where we could go back to the LPC and look at that research. But because this is created in the 1890s, we can then go to the 1900 census, go to the 1910 census, find out who these people were. And then once we have those names, as I was talking about with Trinity Cemetery, we can then look for marriage records. We can look for school records. You know, we can look for any number of things because history is the story of people. So when we're doing research, yes, we can do architectural research and we can say why these buildings are significant, but what makes our city significant is the people who live here, the people who interact with these buildings. And what's interesting, and I'm sure we'll discuss this in the discussion portion of this talk, is that the LPC, the Landmarks Preservation Commission, has designation categories for architectural significance as well as for cultural significance, so that, okay, a building might not look like it's anything to write home about, but what use did it have in the community? Who lived there? Who worked there? Who interacted with this? How did this enhance the city? I really like the essential thesis of Ada Louise Huxtable, who was an architectural critic, actually the first daily architectural critic in the nation. She began that work at the New York Times in 1963. And she said that good architecture, good design was only good if it enhanced the lives of the people who interacted with it. And so that also informs the way that I think, which is, who are the people living in these buildings, walking these streets? And that's a really interesting question when it comes to something like this. So this is Audubon Terrace. We're going to see a lot of the Audubon name around this neighborhood, of course, named for John James Audubon and the land that was once his estate. So that question of what is the land use in our city, and who has owned this land, and how then is this land developed? And so one way that this land was developed was the creation of Audubon Terrace. And Audubon Terrace is really interesting because it was developed essentially as like a turn of the century Lincoln Center, if you want. It was built as a unified cultural campus by Archer M. Huntington, who founded as its focal point the Hispanic Society of America, which he founded in 1904 and then finished. This building was finished in 1908. And we can see, if we look at this, that there is, you know, an entire cultural complex here, which is how I say that it was meant almost as a Lincoln Center, that it was built essentially as a unified piece of cultural architecture. And the hope was that other institutions would join, and so on and so forth. And so today you have not only the Hispanic Society of America, but also the American Academy of Arts and Letters is here. And so when we talk then about archival research in those two places, you know, that's a pretty quick fix in terms of, okay, you know, where are the archives of the Hispanic Society? Where are the archives of the American Institute of Arts and Letters? Things like that. And to me, though, what's really wonderful about something like the Hispanic Society is that this is a living institution, which means it's also engaged with the history of its surroundings. And so today, when we think about taking history out of the archives and into the streets, they are actually hosting, as we speak, an exhibit on Audubon Terrace, so outside on the street for the people, that is stories from Upper Manhattan, stories of the Latinx diaspora. And so we can see some of that work here, which you can see today literally out on the street. So tracing the history of Washington Heights, which we can see if we look at the Hispanic Society founded in 1904, there has been for more than a century a Hispanic presence in the neighborhood. And of course now, Washington Heights considered to be Little Dominican Republic, a very rich Latinx history and community in the neighborhood, which the institution is celebrating as we speak. And then this brings us now in terms of spaces regarded in association with Audubon and the Audubon land. We have Audubon Park, which is built along Riverside Drive from essentially 157th Street to 160th Street. And we can look at this. And I'll give you, here's an image of Riverside Drive. And so in terms of that kind of history, then there's a number of ways that we can look into this history. One is through the history of the elongation of Riverside Drive and who built that and the original goals of Riverside Drive as laid out by Frederick Law Olmsted in the 1870s, the original goals of something like Riverside Park, and then the West Side Improvement, originally conceived in the 1890s and executed by Robert Moses in the 1930s, and the politics and goals of that. But also, when we think about development in New York City, we're always thinking about transportation and the subway and things like that. And so the development of Washington Heights in a lot of ways had to do with the coming of rapid transit, which is why this is one of the last areas of our city to be built up residentially in the way that we think of the city of New York. It's because the subway did not reach this far north until at least 1907. So the subway itself opens in 1904, but we won't get this far north until at least 1907. And then Riverside Drive itself is not going to be rechristened Riverside Drive until 1908. So that's a very old and common story in our city, which is how do you make something covetable? How do you make real estate covetable? And it's by changing the name of an area to make it sound more inviting. So we have the christening of Riverside Drive, which sounds really beautiful and things like that. And so in the same way that today we have something like Tribeca, or we have Dumbo, or we have even the East Village. There was no such thing as the East Village prior to the 1960s. It used to be the Lower East Side, right? And so we can see that kind of history as a constant in our city. And so for something like this, if I'm researching apartment buildings in Audubon Park, I can look, and because it's landmarked, I can go to the LPC, but also the Department of Buildings, and then the Office of Metropolitan History, which is a really wonderful resource created by Christopher Gray, who used to write the Streetscapes column in the New York Times. I can also look at historical newspapers. I can look at the architectural record, all of which is held at Columbia University, but which you can find online. Columbia University also holds a really wonderful real estate brochure collection, which you can also find digitized. And so you can actually find the way that these buildings were originally advertised in the 1920s, which is really wonderful. Audubon Park was built essentially from 1905 to about 1930. So it spans quite a lot of time, but in terms of like those buildings that were built in the Art Deco period, most of them were, you can find those original advertisements, which is really wonderful. And then speaking of the Audubon name. Of course, we have the Audubon Ballroom. This was built as a vaudeville theater in 1912, Thomas W. Lamb. And so if you want the history of this as a vaudeville theater, you can look into that kind of history around Thomas W. Lamb. But of course, the Audubon Ballroom is best known as the site of the assassination of Malcolm X in 1965. And so if you're looking for those records and that kind of history, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture is really wonderful. This is also not only known as the Audubon Ballroom, but the Shabazz Center, which is dedicated also to Malcolm and Betty Shabazz. So they will also have research and records around that. So even within the neighborhood itself, there are a lot of ways to learn about that history.
Lucy, we have 2 questions on the chat. The
Sure.
first one is going back to Highbridge. Is there a connection between Edgar Allan Poe and Highbridge?
That's a good question. So Edgar Allan Poe lived at the Brennan farmhouse on 84th Street and Broadway. So Edgar Allan Poe definitely has a connection to the Upper West Side, absolutely. And so Edgar Allan Poe wrote The Raven in that farmhouse, and he often spent time in Riverside Park. There is a rocky outcrop in Riverside Park called Mount Tom, named for Tom Brennan, the son of the owner of that Brennan farmhouse. And so Edgar Allan Poe would go to Mount Tom and sit there and write and wander and ponder weak and weary. But I am not so familiar with a history of Edgar Allan Poe and the Highbridge itself, but certainly on the Upper West Side. And then also, I guess in if you think about Columbia University as being, I guess, Morningside Heights, but if you're looking for a piece of that farmhouse further uptown, you can actually find the mantle of the Brennan farmhouse where Poe worked at Columbia University. So I don't know if that's a good answer to your question. So there is definitely Poe history relatively close by, but I'm not sure of it in relation to the Highbridge.
Okay. And the second question that we have on our chat is, where exactly is the Trinity Cemetery that you just showed?
Sure. So the Trinity Cemetery is the southern border of Washington Heights. So it's at 155th Street. And you can enter at 155th Street and Riverside Drive is the best way to get in. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. So I just wanted to show, and I'm almost done, and I promise we'll get to the interactive section of this. I'm almost done, I promise. I just wanted to show, in terms of the way that this part of town was developed, it was developed largely, as I said, after the opening of the subway. And then, so we have the subway opening in the first and second decades of the 20th century, but then we also have the First World War. And the First World War leads us to a building hiatus. There's really not a lot of building in New York during the war, but then after the war, there's a building boom, not only because there's this incredible prosperity, right, the Roaring '20s, but also because Governor Al Smith, in particular in 1926, passed a great deal of legislation that essentially said if you build housing in New York City, you can get a 30-year tax abatement. And so suddenly, everybody and their brother was like, ooh, I'm a speculative developer. And so there was just an outpouring of housing. And what happened in Washington Heights is that you had these much larger apartments, much more modern apartments than you would have found further south in Lower Manhattan. And so first, in terms of immigrant communities that begin to come to this part of the neighborhood, this part of Manhattan, first you have the Irish moving off the Lower East Side into these larger apartments. And then later, and I'll talk about this in just a second, in the 30s and 40s, you had a very large Jewish refugee population. 20,000 Jewish refugees from Germany moved into Washington Heights. in the same way, because these were larger middle-class apartments and they had been middle-class people in Germany. And of course, their goal was ultimately survival, but it was where would they want to live in New York? And so would they have wanted to live on the Lower East Side? No, they would want to live here, where you had access to green space, where you had larger apartments. And so Washington Heights was very attractive. And then, of course, following the war in the post-war years, especially from the 60s onward, a large influx of the Latinx community, beginning in the 60s with a Puerto Rican population, attracted for the very same reason as the immigrants who came before them to these large, well-maintained apartments, to the green space around them. And to me, what I love about that, when I look at the census, and in terms of history, when I look at the census and I look at oral histories of the neighborhood, I always learn that people all over the world want the same thing for themselves and their children, always. People want to live with dignity. People want to live with light and with air. They want to feel connected to their neighbors. That is always the case everywhere in New York and at every period in history. And so we see that with successive waves of immigrants who make the neighborhood their own. And then the Art Deco period is interesting in this part of town because it doesn't just give us apartments, it gives us structures that stand in the neighborhood to this day. So one is Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, which is finished in 1928, and of course only expands through the neighborhood. But the records of Columbia Presbyterian are not only at the hospital, not only at the university, but again, at the Department of Buildings, at the Department of Records. If you're looking for something like murals or something like artwork that might be associated with any of these buildings, public art, things like that, a really good resource is the Public Design Commission. The Public Design Commission was founded in 1898, originally on the third floor of City Hall, and it was dedicated to administering like all public art in the city of New York. And so if you ever are looking for something like the history of a fountain in Central Park or something, or you're looking for the history of WPA murals, and the reason that I talk about WPA murals is that when I look at hospitals, right, that's very often those things go hand in hand. You can find that at the Public Design Commission, which is really wonderful. And then another Art Deco, well, this is Neo-Moorish Art Deco, finished in the neighborhood in the Jazz Age, is Yeshiva University, and the school itself will have those records. And so you can look at yearbooks, you can look at class rosters, you can look at literary magazines. It's a very, very rich trove of historical documentation you'd be able to find about students and campus life at Yeshiva University. Here we have yet another Art Deco structure in the neighborhood that thrives to this day and where history is ongoing. So at all of the places that I'm showing you, whether it be Columbia Presbyterian or Yeshiva or the United Palace, this history is ongoing. And what's interesting too, is that this was also designed by Thomas W. Lamb, who designed the Audubon Ballroom. So when we're talking about, while neither of these structures is famous for Thomas W. Lamb, he is part of that history. So what I love about that is that even the things that we don't think we're looking for, even the things that we don't think are unifying themes in our neighborhoods, sometimes often are. And so the architect here is one of those. So you can look into this. Now we have 1931. That brings us to the George Washington Bridge. So this is designed by Othmar Ammann, who was kind of the Robert Moses's bridge czar, if you want. And records around that, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey will have those types of records. The New York Public Library has a really wonderful Moses archive. And then when it comes to people, as I said, history is always people, right? And so when it comes to the immigrant communities of Washington Heights, there are, for example, these are the German Jewish refugees whom I had spoken about just a moment ago, 20,000 of whom came to Washington Heights in the 1930s and 1940s. There are a number of oral history projects that were undertaken to preserve the history and the experiences of these people, which you can find at a number of libraries, not only in New York, but across the nation. If you're looking for sources that are not necessarily in the city, one good place to go to is WorldCat, which will give you a list of any item that you might be looking for and where you might find it across the nation. So let's say a copy of the oral history is held, yeah, there's one in New York, but there's another one, let's say in Michigan. You would be able to find every place that the oral history is held, or any piece of information that you're looking for that matter, but I'm using the oral history as an example. You could find it in WorldCat. It would tell you where, literally where in the world you might be able to find it. And then again, I'll just touch back on Black history in the neighborhood. This is 555 Edgecombe Avenue. This became very well known as a home for some of the most illustrious Black artists in our city's history, including Paul Robeson, who lived here, Count Basie. Now, the reason that 555 Edgecombe Avenue became such a hive for Black artists is that it is just north of what's known as Sugar Hill, which was one of the most sought after parts of Harlem. And then this building, if we're talking about the historical dynamics that shape a neighborhood, this building actually would have been restricted to Black tenants until the late 1940s. So it wasn't really until 1947 that the well-to-do Black people who were living in Sugar Hill had the opportunity, or were even allowed in any way, to move north of 155th Street into Washington Heights. So that history of that type of redlining, those are even bank records you can find, which is kind of interesting. But certainly today, now 160th Street and Edgecombe Avenue is named for Count Basie. So now it's a history of which the building and the city is rightly very proud. And then, so following the Jewish refugee immigration and then the admittance of Black Americans into Washington Heights, there was also a wave of Greek immigration to the neighborhood, and this part of town became known as the Astoria of Manhattan. And so there are still to this day, while there is no longer very much of a Greek presence in Washington Heights, there are still a couple of Greek Orthodox churches in the neighborhood. And so in terms of finding archival records around the community, those are really wonderful places to go, because those will be repositories of marriage records, christenings, who was attending Sunday services, who gave money to the church, things like that. And so then again, you'll start to get names. And then once you get names, you can go to the census and where did these people live, and which buildings and where in the neighborhood. And so it becomes a patchwork of human life and human experience and who is interacting with this neighborhood. And then of course, this question of who is interacting with this neighborhood, from the 1960s forward, the largest immigrant community has been the Latinx community, and in particular, the Dominican community in Washington Heights. And that is, of course, a vibrant and ongoing interaction of who's living where and what interaction is a community having with the buildings in which they live. And so something like that yes, there can be archival research, but there's also a living experience here. And so one really wonderful place to go to get some information or to be part of the experience of the Latinx community in Washington Heights, one place is WordUp, a community bookshop, a bilingual community bookshop that offers history and politics and even mutual aid to the Latinx community in Washington Heights. Like for right now, there is a community fridge sponsored by WordUp and things like that. And so it functions as a community hub. And so history is a living document. History is always living. And so what's wonderful is in Washington Heights, that history of the Latinx community is deeply enthralled and continues every day. And then walking our streets, we can see that, right? That history is not just something we find in a book, not just something we find in an archive, but something that we see as we walk along our streets. And that's certainly what we can see in Washington Heights today. So I'll stop sharing my screen and we can just talk.
Thank you very much, Lucie. That was really, really wonderful. You covered so much in that short period and touched on so many things. I've got dozens of questions, but we'll have to focus on just a couple because I think we've got maybe 15 minutes of question time. One that comes to mind immediately is actually based on a question that someone asked earlier, and it was about Edgar Allan Poe and Highbridge. There is perhaps what the person was asking about. There's this image which looks sort of like a daguerreotype. I think it was actually a painting, which shows Poe on the High Bridge with his cape sort of flowing behind him. It's very dramatic, but it's pieced together. I mean, it's out of the artist's mind. But what that brings to mind is myth versus fact. You see this image, you have Poe on the bridge, and that becomes almost factual that he was on that bridge. So when you're doing your work and when you're leading your tours and working with history, what do you find is the place for myth in history?
Wow, that's such a wonderful question. I love that. I think that something like that, I'm not aware of the image that you're speaking about, but I would wonder, when was that image created? Who was the artist who made it? You know, and so that to me is the history, right? It's this question of why, you know, how did this artist come to revere Poe so much that he's imagining Poe on the High Bridge? And what is the intersection of Poe and the High Bridge, and what does that mean to the artist? Of like, here is this extraordinary feat of engineering, and we can document that, how it's so extraordinary. And then we can document the work of Poe and what makes that extraordinary and his relationship to the city of New York. He lived all over New York City, right? He lived at Poe Cottage in the Bronx. He lived at the Brennan Farmhouse, as I mentioned. He lived downtown on what was once called Amity Street and is now West 3rd Street. And so to me, when I think about like a mythic image of Poe on the High Bridge, first of all, I'll say there's no reason to believe that he didn't stroll on the High Bridge. A lot of people did, you know. But secondly, I'll say, like, what does the image of Poe on the High Bridge mean to 19th century New York City? And that would be something that I would want to research, is like, you know, who was reading Poe at that time? What would seeing an image of Poe have meant to New Yorkers? And by that, I mean, could I have found that image, you know, in Leslie's Weekly? Could I have found it in, you know, a cartoon by Thomas Nast or something, who was one of the, or if not the leading political cartoonist in New York at that time? You know, who was making this and who would have seen it in New York, and what would that have meant? So that's something that I can research. And that brings me back to, like, how can I document this?
Right. Which then leads me into another question, because you mentioned also about lost history, and that history, in a sense, isn't really lost. It's just lost to us, maybe for a while until someone rediscovers it. But then there's also the idea of reinterpreted history.
Sure.
And I think we're going through a phase now nationally where we are grappling with history that has been taught not just accidentally inaccurately, but intentionally inaccurately. And so how do you deal with that? Again, say in your walks or in your research, working with bringing history out of the archives into the streets as to correcting some history.
Sure. So there is so much more history than what we learn. Like that, I think, is the thesis of my work. Um, if I had anything to say, it is always that there is a history of everything and everything is history. But the way that history is taught is not that. History is taught as a narrative, for better or for worse. A lot of times for worse, because the question is, how do we create a cohesive narrative? And then who do we allow into that narrative? And we're not the only ones. I think there's a lot of pain in this country right now as to who has been put into or left out of that narrative, but that is a universal thing. Like, for example, at the dissolution of the Habsburg Empire, there were Czech nationalists who wanted to create the impetus for the Czech Republic, what would later become the Czech Republic. And so they needed to find an original Czech history outside of the Habsburg Empire. And so what they did was they literally like made up history, and they made up documents, and they buried them in the ground, and then they found them. And they were like, oh, look, we have found evidence that, you know, the Czech nation needs to be its own nation, right? And so the point is that everybody all over the world, people look for narratives because people need a cohesive understanding of who they are and where they live. And that's fine. That doesn't make anybody a bad person for needing a cohesive narrative. But the question is, what is a cohesive narrative and what goes into it? And so for me, my understanding is that there is a history of everything, and everything is history. So if somebody says that they don't like history, I always like to say, but yes, you do, because you like something. So for example, I'm just looking at my own little box here on this screen, and I see, and I know that there are posters behind me which are framed, right? And so there's a history, there's a history of poster art, right? There's a history of framing. If I look into other people's boxes, I see that Margot's box has a bookshelf. You know, there's a history of the kind of carpentry that would create bookshelves. There's a history of books. There's a history of publishing. You name it. There's a history of anything you love. There is a history, which means that history is the most egalitarian thing that there is, because every human experience, all human creation is history. And so what I'll say is, there can be a new narrative. Just because a narrative has been created doesn't mean that that's the only narrative. And what's really wonderful to me is, and I saw this, I think, too, with COVID, is that we're in a moment of crisis, or we have been in a moment of crisis. And generally, moments of crisis allow for the fissure of a narrative, which is what we're seeing now, which is, wait, who do we include? What nation is this? But we're not alone in this, and this is not the first time that this has happened. So in the 1930s, during the New Deal, when the Roosevelt administration created the WPA, one part of the WPA, one part of the Federal Arts Project was the Federal Writers Project. And during the Federal Writers Project, the government sent thousands of workers across the nation to record oral histories, and to record narratives, and to record interviews with regular Americans all over the nation. And so that led to the original slave narratives. That led to narratives of people, working on farms in Oklahoma, people who had been who had fallen off of skyscrapers, driving rivets in Manhattan. It was people all over the country. And it was this question of, what is the new American narrative? Who are we as a people? Who are we as a nation? And so it was called like First Person America. It was this sense of building into the American narrative as many perspectives as those researchers could find. And so today I take that as my kind of impetus, which is to say, okay, history is infinite. There is no end. There is no way to say that this is the end of the story, this is the end of the narrative. It's not. And we can build any narrative that we want. So when I think about my tours, I think about, okay, here are the things that I know about a neighborhood, for example. But what are the things I don't know? Where are the people who I'm not hearing about? And how can I find those people? And often the people that I'm not hearing about are Black people, people of color, women, children, working class people, and so those are situations where I have to go back then to census records, right? And it's who's living in these buildings, who is occupying this space. And then once the question of who's occupying this space, okay, where else can I find them? Do I find them in school records? Do I find them in church records? Okay, if I do I find them in newspapers? Who attended this university? Who was the first person to do this? And then build. So I always say, like, there is no set narrative, and we can build a new one if we build it on the knowledge of the people around us, our friends and neighbors. And so to me, history is always people, and it's the question of who's here, not who we think is here and who we know is here, but literally who is here, who are these people, and really going down into the personal, I think is how we can re-understand our history if we try.
Hey, thanks very much, Lucy. Eloquently said, really. We're about 2 minutes before the hour, Diego, so I guess we probably should be closing out, much as I don't want to, because this is a fascinating discussion.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I'm going to be posting Lucy's website, the website to her tour company, Archive on Parade. Please feel free to check it out. And on that website, you can also find her contact information if you want to get in touch with her to see her job, her work as a tour guide. And I'm also going to type my email address. And please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, if you have any suggestions on who else should we invite to talk about history of Upper Manhattan. And thank you so much. I'll be posting this talk on YouTube, and I'm gonna send it to all of you so that we can all go back to this amazing, wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Lucy. It was really, really interesting. And Matthew, thank you so much for being with us. And I look forward to seeing you all in our next meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Bye.
Bye.
Good night.